graduated with a Bachelor of Early Childhood Education degree, cum laude, and a certificate in reading specialization, recipient of Service and Leadership Award. He received his Master of Arts in Teaching with specialization in reading at the Philippine Normal University, outstanding reading graduate. He took his PhD in reading education at PNU and took PhD in English Studies units at the University of Santo Tomas, Manila. And now, finishing his PhD in curriculum and instruction at the Philippine Normal University, Manila. He is currently an education consultant to multiple institutions, including Vibal Group Incorporated. Ladies and gentlemen, please
PhD in
welcome
reading
our
education
speaker
at
for this afternoon, Brother Roderick M. Aguirre, PhD.
Good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Just practicing my British accent for later. Read aloud session of reading out the short story. All right, so this afternoon I'll be talking about dealing with teaching comprehension of narrative text. I know there are a lot of text types out there, but just now we're just going to focus on the narrative text where mostly our elementary students are faced with the task of understanding lots of narrative text, not just in English or Filipino, but across subject areas. But let's understand how we can help our students be able to understand narrative text. So here's my slide. Let's share. All right, there you go. So our title for this afternoon's webinar is all about teaching comprehension of narrative text, developing critical reading skills through understanding of text elements of narratives. To begin with, I would like us to understand the perspective that the teaching of reading is highly influenced by, one, the teacher's reading skills. Our teachers or you teachers teach reading to your students in the elementary or even in high school or even in college based on how you read, or based on your level of skills in reading. Also, the way you teach reading is highly influenced by how your teachers before taught you how to read. Then moreover, and not just how your teachers before taught you how to read, but also how the speakers and facilitators and trainers taught you how reading should be taught. These are basically factors that influence who you are as to becoming a real teacher of reading. But today I'll just give you a more practical way, an easy way to teach comprehension of narrative text. I'll focus more on your reading skills. So remember, the premise is that you cannot teach what you do not have. So I believe that for you to become effective reading teachers, helping students comprehend narrative text, is that you have impeccable set of reading skills in understanding narrative texts. So it's a combination of your skills and how I'm going to teach you how it's done. So our outline for afternoon session would be, again, my way of going through my presentation would be question and answer format. So here are the questions that I will go through in my session. We will start with, what is comprehension? Next would be, what is narrative text? What is the purpose of narrative texts? How do the elements of the story help in comprehending narrative texts? And how is comprehension of narrative text extended to other skills? And then after that, we'll have a mini workshop, just a little bit of I'll show you a narrative text, and then we're going to practice comprehending it. And then we'll have question and answer. I'll be answering questions from you guys. And then finally, we'll have conclusions and implications. Basically, I have an hour and a half to finish my talk. So let us begin with the first question, though. What is comprehension and the reading process? All right. So it's just more of let's define first these terms so that we will have similar understanding, and we're coming from this definition, and let's lay out the foundation as to what comprehension is in general and what is reading process in general is. All right. So these are some of the statements about comprehension. It's the essence of reading and learning. Therefore, reading is synonymous to understanding synonymous to comprehension. Hence, if you are not understanding what you're reading, you're not reading at all. You're just barking at print, or you are just probably literally taking in information from the selection, but it has to be the essence of reading per se. They go hand in hand. Reading is comprehension. Reading is understanding. Without it, you are not reading at all. And incidentally, we just read using our eyes, all right? But it's the brain that reads, because for the blind, they do not use their eyes to read, but they use their hands to read. But it's not the hands nor the eyes that reads. They are just the ones that receive the information, but it's the brain that processes. Therefore, reading is a highly reconstruction of the intended meaning of the communication. So it's a reconstruction of information from the text through the eyes, the sense of sight, or sense of the hands through braille, and we reconstruct and come up with what could be the possible meaning being presented in the selection. I'll show you different perspectives how to understand selections though. And next, the word process, all right? It is a process in which the learner constructs meaning. We would like to focus more on the process instead of just the product. What we do is that after teaching or asking our students or requiring our students to read a selection or watch a film, well, let's just focus on reading. Reading a selection, we ask them lots of questions that do not necessarily focus on the process, but focuses on reading as a product. Once they answer the question, that's the end of the comprehension. That should not be it. It should be a continuous progressive process, okay? So comprehension then it's like this. So this is now the perspective. We have the readers, all right? And then we have the text. Why, if students, one type of comprehension or perspective of processing of comprehension is that when the reader imposes meaning on the text, that is top-down process. The child or the reader uses his or her schema to give meaning to text. I'm not saying it's wrong. It is also right, but it's not the one and all and the end of all comprehension. It is just one of the processes of comprehension. We need to teach our students to pay attention to details, to information, to certain words or statements presented in the text so that they can verify if the comprehension they impose on the text is actually what the text is all about. All right? So it has to be, it's a constant negotiation. There's a possibility that the students understood the text, but misunderstood the message of the author. So we need to teach our students the process of looking back, recursive. It's a recursive process of going back to the text, making sure that our students use still the text as basis to check whether their comprehension is not. More often than not, what reading teachers are doing is that they utilize their own comprehension as the basis for the right comprehension of the selection. I would say it's right if the teacher was the one who wrote the selection. But remember, if the teacher is not the writer of the text, he or she is one of the readers of the selection. So we want the teacher to process the information the way it should be processed, interactive, looking at proofs in the selection, not jumping to conclusions. So the second process is bottom up, looking at details in the selection and making sure that our students check, look for cues that provide them with proofs that their understanding of the selection is right, okay? We also need to teach our students to bear in mind that the text is a representation or representative of the author's meaning and purpose, all right? So it still is a communication process. Remember, through the text, we would like our students, our readers, to communicate with the writer and try to understand what the writer is trying to tell our students and to us as teachers, being part of being in the reading process. Now, the author's meaning and purpose is now the author's text. Hence, the text is a representative or representation of the author. And it's our responsibility also to understand the perspective of the author, not just our own perspective. This is what I've been saying, and this is what I said a while ago, that we may understand the text, but misunderstand the author. All right. Okay. So that's the writing process. Though I'm not going to discuss the writing process, but we'll just focus more on the interactivity of the text as a representative of the authors, meaning and how our students are understanding it. And then, of course, what as teachers, being there as scaffold, as teachers, as scaffold, we would like to teach our students that reading is a process, not a product. All right, it's a continuous process. That it's a constant negotiation of meaning of the author and the reader via the proofs and the evidences in the selection. All right. So this is what we call as interactive compensatory process, meaning sometimes the understanding of the student of the selection may be wrong, and the proof would be it could be refined via some of the statements or some of the lines or some of the events presented in the selection. So our job is to help our students not to say you're right, you're wrong. No, we would like to reaffirm, refine their comprehension by helping them go back to the selection and guide them to understand not just the text, but also the message of the author. So these are the three elements in the interplay of the comprehension process. And I think what's happening in the field right now is that we're only teaching our students to understand the text, to give meaning to text, but we are somehow failing to help them understand that there is a message from the text and there's a message coming from the author via the text. I think this three-way process is a very complex process to take in, but there's a way to do that. I'll show you in a while how we can help our students go through the three perspectives of the comprehension process: the reader's perspective, the text perspective, and the author's perspective. Put them together, come up with a mesh of three elements, and then it becomes interactive compensatory process. Right? So I don't have enough time though, but what I'm trying to say here is that if you look at the elements here, you can find that there are the following elements. You have here a couple there at the bottom. I think the guy's hand is on holding I think the woman, comforting her perhaps because of the gloomy color. And there's a baby, a fetus that is shape of a fetus. I mean, out of the twigs and the branches of the tree, and I probably come up with a story. Here's the point here is that when we comprehension means is that we're able to come up with a mental picture, all right, a mental picture of what we are reading. So if our students are struggling to come up with a mental picture, perhaps they struggle with words. They have word meaning or word knowledge issues. Now, students cannot have of understanding of words together, the syntactic problems perhaps, and the cueing systems are off, then our students may probably have decoding problems. So what we want our students to understand is that they need to come up with a clear mental picture of what they're reading. And it's the same with us. Like when we're reading, we're laughing, and then because we are able to see, come up with a mental picture of jokes in what we are reading in print, okay? So now we're done with the first question, what is comprehension and the reading process. I think that's clear. We're looking at comprehension as a process, not just as a product. And the three elements, we have the reader's perspective, the text perspective, and the author's perspective. Our job as a teacher is to help our students put together all of these perspectives and understand all sides of the selection. So let's now understand what is a narrative text. So narrative text is synonymous to the word story. So a narrative or a story cannot be a story without a conflict. Story revolves around a conflict. So it has elements, the plot, we have the exposition where we get to have a general gist of the story, a general good feeling about the story, and it's a start whether we like it or not. And then finally, there's building up of tension, moving towards the building up of tension, meaning rising of action. And then finally, we are at the edge of our chair, and as if we can no longer stop reading because it gets too interesting. and we are emotionally engaged already, and that's the climax part now. Then finally we get to understand how that, oh, so this is how it's gonna be, that the ending of the story would be. So it becomes a falling action, we're done with the heightened emotions, and finally a resolution that the character was able to solve or not the conflict of the story. I If you look at my icons here, it focuses on emotions because we need to engage our students emotionally. This is not like any other text, like a information recount or a news report or an argumentative text. In narrative, there are different emotions. It's a roller coaster of emotions. That's why the plot is likened to different emotions building up, okay, at every part, and every major part of the story. Okay. So again, the answer to the question, what is a narrative text? It's a series of events that is centered on a conflict. So let's summarize our definition. A narrative text is a type of text that describes a sequence of fiction or non-fictional, made up events or true events, events which centers on a major conflict. If there is no conflict and it's just a series of events, then it's probably just narration, a type of writing that, or a writing that could be integrated in, say, in an essay or integrated in a simple recount, and so on and so on, simple recount and other types of other text types. So it, again, the element should be there to begin with. It should have a major conflict. All events must center on the conflict. All right. So I think the first question, I think the first thing that we need to teach our kids, our students to read a narrative text is it. They should look for the conflict. They should know where the conflict is located, and once they're able to find the conflict, the rest is easy to understand. Okay. So before we go to that detail, let's now understand answer the third question. What is the purpose of the narrative text? Simple. So the narrative text, we write stories, authors write stories, one, to entertain us, all right? We write scripts, we write um, um, uh, scripts for drama, short stories, parables, fables, and so on. Not just necessarily for to give information, but one, there's an element of entertainment. That's why a lot of readers get to be hooked up with a certain author because they are entertained by the way that author writes a story or builds up a story. Like in my case, right now I'm hooked up with all the books written by Rick Riordan, the one who wrote the Lightning Thief. So he has this four series, and I'm now on the third series of his books. So I'm so captivated because the way he presents the events and the language he uses really entertains me and makes me recall all my Greek mythology, my knowledge on Greek mythology, my knowledge on what's the next series would be on the Roman mythology. The next would be the Egyptian mythology, and I'm now in the fourth series. The fourth series with the Norse mythology. So he has this kind of a series of stories. Now that's to entertain. Next is to capture the reader's interest. So because it's entertaining, it captures the interest of the students, making them read a lot. So it is important for us teachers to understand what is the interest of our students. I know that our students, let's say we have 20 or 30 students, and that's a lot of different interests coming to our students. But the point is, we at least able to address all these interests instead of our interests. So in the reading, in the preparation for teaching or reading, we need to strike a balance between what the students want to read and they ought to read. I think what they ought to read would be focusing on what we want them to learn, in what the reading skills we want them to acquire. So my point here is that we could probably look for selections that are within the interest of our students, because they capture immediately the interest of our students, and that's where we teach the reading skills. What's happening out there is that we prescribe the reading selection, and more often than not, the selection that we chose are those that interest us. but not necessarily interests our students. And because it's not interesting, it is no longer interesting to our students, it is difficult for them to acquire, and difficult for us as well to teach the reading skills. All right. Next, purpose of the narrative would be to teach. Even if it's a narrative, even if it's um, a story, a short story, there would always be um, theme, a lesson, a moral that readers can get from it. Again, there's some misnomers of our teachers in the field. So do not say moral lesson. It could be, it has to be separated. It could be moral, since we're talking about morality, then the moral perhaps, or the lesson that we can get. All right. The lesson is more general in perspective, while moral is more specific, especially if it's a parable and it's fable. That's an element of fable and parable. All right. Now, for short stories and other forms of prose and narratives, mostly we have information or lesson to get from it. But the lesson, again, would entirely be dependent on how the students will understand the narrative. Okay. Next would be to inform. There could be like events in the story that are factual, probably non-fictional, but nonetheless based on certain facts. Like if it's sci-fi, like cloning, at least there's an idea informing them that it's a possibility in science to clone people, which is actually existing right now. Because even if it's non-fictional, it's still based on what's happening right now in the progress of science. Okay. And finally, we have the change perspective, like in the case of, say, novels, Shakespearean novels, Tess the Orbervilles by Oscar Wilde, or even some short stories. It gives us change of perspective, like the story of Footnote to You. And the story is so alarmingly interesting because it gives our students a perspective of what if I get married or get pregnant at a very young age, what will happen? And it shows a vicious cycle of not thinking through of our decisions in life. So that alone has power to change perspective of all the text types existing out there. Narrative has that kind of power. Well, similar with the argument to the text, but unlike for stories, our readers are emotionally involved. That's why when I discussed and I showed to you the definition, the elements, and the nature of the narrative text, I have motives, because part of the narrative would be the emotive language, and the emotion that engages, the emotional part that engages our students to continue reading the selection. And we're done. Let's now proceed to the next question, which is, how do the elements of the story help in comprehending narrative text? I'm just going to check our time. It's already 2:25, so I think I'm still in my with the flow of time. So before I proceed answering this question, let's now first read a narrative. So I have integrated the mini workshop with the fourth question. So the story that we're going to understand or comprehend this afternoon is entitled Eat My Fine Coat. I adopted this from Eat My Fine Coat, written by Barbara Walker in 1991 and reprinted in the fall of 1998 issue of Teaching Tolerance. I will read this to you with the right intonation and the read aloud protocols. So if you have not watched my video, my session on during the preschool series on read aloud and storytelling, you may want to review that. It's in the YouTube channel of the Rebound group. Okay, so let's read. One day, a rich man was invited to a banquet at the home of the most important man in the town. All day, as he worked in his vineyard, the rich man thought with relish of the fine food and the good conversation ahead of him. But alas, he had misjudged his day's work and he arrived home with too little time to dress with the particular care needed for such a grand occasion. It was either not wash and dress or be late for dinner, and he must on no account be late for dinner. So off he went in his workday dress, and with the marks of his day's toil upon his hands and face. When he arrived at the host's door, the rest of the guests had already come, and conversations buzzed around the room. Curiously enough, no one asked the rich man's opinion on any matter, though at other banquets he had been the one most solicited for comment and advice. The host himself scarcely noticed him, and when the time came for the guests to be seated for dinner, the rich man was placed in the spot farthest removed from the host. Quietly, the neglected guest excused himself from the group and hurried home. There, he scrubbed himself from bald head to heels. Next, he attired himself handsomely in his new baggy trousers, an elegant shirt vest, and his largest turban. Then he slipped into his new fur coat, by far the most striking garment in all of the town. At last, he was ready. With his head held high, the rich man presented himself again at the host's door. Every eye was upon him as the servants admitted him to the house. Rising immediately, the host came to greet him and led him straight to the place of honor at his own tray. As the dinner progressed, the host addressed one question after another to his learned guest and served him the finest foods as soon as they were brought in by the servants. But to the host's astonishment, the rich man began stuffing first one food and then another into the generous pockets of his new coat. "Eat my fine coat," he would say each time he tucked another handful of food into the pockets. "Eat my fine coat." First, the host watched. Then everyone watched, but no one could make any sense of the rich man's strange behavior. Finally, the host could remain silent no longer about the matter. "My good sir," said he, "what are you doing?" "Ah, sire, I'm but feeding the guests you've invited to the banquet. When I came the first time this evening, you gave me no notice at all. When I came the second time, you treated me as a guest of honor. I have not changed. I am still the same man. Therefore, it must be my fur coat to which you are giving such an honor. Since my coat is the guest of honor, it should have a fair share of this fine food." All right, so that's the story we're going to unravel and decode and understand as we go through the progress of comprehending narrative text through the story elements. All right. I'm not saying that you have to go British with your accent during dialogues, but that's how I do it. But you can come up with your own accent in making sure to decipher that a change of your voice and intonation, a change of pitch would mean a change of characterization. All right, so let's just say these are the questions you're going to ask. So question number one, how do you like the story? How did you not like the story? Why did you or did you not like the story? Which part of the story you do or do not like about the story? Now, these questions are really good for the reader's perspective because naturally when we read, we have our own understanding of the selection, correct? It's in the natural process of reading, we do not necessarily immediately think, what is the message of the author here? No, while we are reading, we're actually trying to give meaning to what the words in the selection says. So it is but natural if the first questions that we ask our students pertain to how they understood the selection. All right. Again, remember we're on the perspective of teaching comprehension, and we're looking at three perspectives of the comprehension: the reader's perspective, the text perspective, and the author's perspective. And we need to traverse and help our students progress from their own understanding of the selection to understanding the selection and to understanding the author via the selection. All right. So that being said, these questions help our students uh, undergo the top-down process of understanding a narrative text. So if you have not had created if your materials or modules or for your online materials and you utilize narrative text and you immediately moved on to text-based understanding and author's perspective understanding, students feel like, don't my understanding of the text matter? Why do I feel like when I go through modules that focus on comprehension of narratives, it feels like my understanding of the selection doesn't matter? Okay, so we need to we need to consider that perspective, that we consider first our students' understanding. And at this point here, there's no such thing as wrong comprehension. Everything that we need to, all the answers, the individual answers of the students are totally different. But we cannot include this in our assessment. Okay, we cannot include this in our assessment because that cannot be checked. There is no one correct answer. Therefore, by asking these questions, we're able to see if students are able to use their background knowledge, their backgrounds, their schema into the selection, into the reading process. All right. Remember, we're talking about the teaching and perspective of any teaching situation for that matter means starting where the students are. And at this point, like in teaching reading narrative text, comprehending narrative text, is that we need to start where our students are in terms of how they understood the selection. All right, not making the students feel stupid that their understanding of the selection is not what you thought it should be. All right, so you start there. So at least you get to know the individual perspectives, the individual understanding of your students on the selection. Then we move on. But that's not enough. Remember, it's a process, not a product. If we end our comprehension exercise here on just reading perspective, and that's the end of comprehension, then that's what we're looking at reading comprehension as a product. We're done. All right. But we need to go on and make our students understand that it's a process. Comprehension does not end with whether I understood, on my own perspective, I understood selection. No, it does not end there. We need to say, am I right with my understanding of the selection? All right, so questions like, what is the central problem or conflict in the story? Remember again that the story cannot be a story if it does not revolves around a conflict. All right, question like, where and when does the story take place? I think you know where I'm getting at. Who faces and solves the problem or conflict in the story? Who creates the problem or conflict in the story? The sixth is who faces and solves. Well, the seven is who creates the problem. Next, number eight, how does the protagonist react to the problem or conflict in the story? Ninth question would be, what is the consequence of the protagonist's reaction to the problem or conflict in the story? What is the resolution of the story, and what is the central theme of the story? All of this question is what we call as text perspective. Everything of the story elements are in the story. They are there. It may not be explicitly mentioned. They may be implicitly mentioned, but our job as teachers is to help our students look for the clues that pertain to the story elements. All right. And that's why it's called text perspective. And by doing this, we get to make our students refine their personal understanding of the selection, or if not refine, it may also give, if their understanding of their personal understanding of the selection is aligned to the text per se, then it confirms that how they understood the selection is similar to how it was written. All right. It is now called readers. There's also reader's perspective, because even if the information is text-based, the student still will have to rummage through the information in the selection, especially the stories does not necessarily directly and explicitly mention all the elements. They do not say like, this is the setting of the story. It does not say that the protagonist of the story is. No, they have they from the events in the story, from the plot, from the parts of the plot, they look for the clues so that they will be able to answer this question, be able to extract the elements of the story. Therefore, the students now are negotiating and they are rummaging through the text in order for them to understand the selection. But in like manner, readers still give meaning to the text because they have to rummage through the selection. But it does not end there. It is not just text perspective and reader's perspective, also known as interactive compensatory process. Okay, we have to proceed because remember that reading is a continuous process. It's a process per se. So we now move on to the questions like, what is the author's? I should have the. What is the article the? What is the author's purpose in writing the story? What part or parts in the story proves the purpose of the writer? What is the author's message in the story? What part or parts in the story proves the message of the author? These questions pertain to the understanding the author's perspective by the text and making our students refine their understanding of the selection, still interactive compensatory process. I think what's happening out there in teaching narratives is that it is more of a product and not as a process. And what we want to help our students understand is that all of these skills, all of this perspective, this steps, this process that we go through understanding narrative is exactly the same process that happens from one text to another. But what I don't understand is that if you want to focus more on the theme, we provide our students with a different selection. And if we want our students to focus on the setting, we provide them with another selection. We waste a lot of selection when and text integrity is compromised. My point here is that do utilize the same selection and then say the selection is used, the same story is used for this week, but focusing only on certain elements. And then the next week, same story, but focusing on another element. My point here is that there is one selection, okay, that all of the skills are being taught on. Otherwise, if you have one skill, a sub-skill in teaching comprehending narratives, and every skill, let's say identifying the characters or the major characters, a different selection, identifying the setting, another selection. It's like indirectly telling your students that you only choose one type of skill for a certain selection. You're not teaching your students that all of these skills are being utilized, all of the skills from the reader's perspective down to understanding the author's perspective in one selection. So I don't understand why we compromise text integrity. Just a question though. And it's the same question that I ask when you give them tests. That every question of a certain element of the story, there will be a different selection. Why not? For questions 1 to 20 or question 1 to 10, read the story. And all those questions about that story should emanate from one story because we are supposed to comprehend one selection and all the skills are at play in one selection. All right. I hope you got my point. Oh my gosh, I think that's too much information I've given. All right, so let's go back to the climax again, to the plot, the elements of the story, and we're going to understand where the location of the story elements are. So by teaching our students, our teaching should be on the process of going through the story. So we start with exposition, teach our students understanding of the exposition and extract the elements of the story, then moving on to the rising action and extract rising action to the climax and extracting the elements of the story again, and then from falling action to resolution and extracting the elements of the story so that comprehension is taking place. So there's always comprehension in every event or major event in the story, and it would be nice that if we have stopping points at strategic places, strategic points in the story, and not just allowing our students to read by themselves. So when you develop materials at home, make sure that you caught, say, this is the exposition part, then I have questions or discussion part. I have rising action and climax, rising in action, then I have my discussion points. And falling action and resolution, I have my discussion points to facilitate the process of comprehension. What's happening usually is that we give questions before reading, and then after reading the whole selection, our students answer the questions at the end. And what they usually do is that once they read the questions at the end, they go back to the selections and reread the whole selection again, making the first attempt a futile and a waste of time. All right, so let's start with the first element of the plot, which is exposition. Exposition has three story elements: the setting, the major characters, and the conflicts. So here we teach our students, let's say it's the first two paragraphs would be exposition, and the setting would be the time. Usually the time could be implicitly saying what day, what time of the day, by saying the afternoon or twilight or dinner or supper. You know, it's 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. You don't do dinner in the morning. Right, that's breakfast. So there are certain words that would help our students understand and extract the setting or the time per se. Also, it could be an era. Okay, it could be during the time of the golden years in Europe by Elizabethan era. It could be Shakespearean. It could be also be the contemporary. So at least there would be words or statements that would help our students understand that it's within that era. And if our students are able to identify the time, they will be able to comprehend it during the context of that place and time. Next would be, of course, the location where the story is taking place. All right. And it helps our students situate their understanding. Oh, so this is in the mountains. Okay. So this is would be how I should understand it. I should not operate on the perspective that since I am from the city, and I will understand the selection by the city. So I said, what the heck are they doing? Why are they walking from mountains and then crossing streams when they could just hire a cab? Excuse me, you cannot have that kind of comprehension, because the setting is already mentioned and implicitly mentioned in the selection, and you need to operate your understanding of the selection via where the story is situated. All right, and it does our job to help our students refine their comprehension. All right, so it's exposition. Sorry, in the exposition part, there's a lot of things that you need to help your students comprehend. So again, it's a no-no for me when you're teaching comprehension of narrative text that you leave your students alone understanding the selection, or you read the whole selection without making students understand that this part here, this initial parts of the story would be exposition, and they're supposed to understand the setting, the major characters, and the conflict. All right. So the major characters are the protagonist and the antagonist. So for us to understand and to help our students identify who the protagonist is, the characters, there are many characters in the story. Say there are a lot of characters in the story, but they need to pinpoint of the many characters in the story, there's but one protagonist or a group of protagonists that would say faces and solves the conflict. All right, faces and solves the conflict, is present in all major events in the story. These are the two considerations that a character should satisfy to be identified as a protagonist. A lot of Filipino teachers or teachers in the Philippines, the Filipino teachers, not the language per se, but teachers in the Philippines, when they teach identifying the protagonist or the hero in the story, well, not just hero, because there's what we call as a villain hero or villain protagonist. Well, anyway, that would be a different discussion altogether. The protagonist in the story is always the one with the positive values, with good values, sound values. The one is always the underdog and all. Well, that would be the context in the Philippines. But what if the story is not written by a Filipino? It would have a different perspective altogether. Therefore, it is not a consideration. The values or the attitude of the character is not a major consideration in identifying it as a protagonist. What we need to teach our students is that the character to become protagonist must satisfy these two considerations. One, faces and solves the conflict. Next, is present in all major events in the story. May not be present, but may always be talked about. All right. Next, like we have antagonist. The second one is the antagonist. So if the protagonist faces and solves the conflict, the antagonist is the one who creates the main conflict. And also is the one who opposes or combats the protagonist at every point in the story, or a contrapath, a contrapositive character in the story. It could be one person, it could be a group of people, moving against the protagonist to solve the conflict. So these are the things that will be presented during the exposition, and we need to help our students understand that. All right. And finally, we have the conflict. The conflict would be where the story is centered on. The problem could be a character versus himself, like in the case of an internal conflict, like in the case of most of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales or stories. Another one would be in the case of some of the stories of Hansel and Gretel. But most of our stories in the Philippines maturity would be more of character versus character, meaning another character is a protagonist and another character is antagonist. Some stories would have again character versus himself. That means he's the protagonist and the antagonist himself, meaning he's the one who solves the problem, but at the same time he was the one who created the problem. All right. So next would be character versus nature, like the stories of say natural disasters happening. So that's character versus nature. And then we have character versus society, like the culture of the society goes against the belief of a certain character. Let's say an idea of a feminist perspective in writing a story would be looking at how society views women, and then write a story making women vulnerable to the affections of men, like in India, and then trying to make the readers understand that it is not acceptable just because they're women and so on and so forth. Men can always, do whatever they like to do with the women. So it's more of the character versus society. And next we have character versus supernatural in the case like the mythology, the case mythology legends. And next we have character versus technology, which is the common right now for the sci-fi. These are some of the most common types of conflict. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need to help our students in the exposition part alone identify the setting, which would determine location, major characters, protagonists, antagonists, and conflict. If they have a problem, and if we did not guide our students to understand the exposition part of the story, there will be comprehension back down or miscomprehension of the whole selection. But then again, they will still understand the selection in their own perspective, but not the way the text was written. Okay, so that's exposition part. And next we have rising action. The rising action presents a series of events leading to the protagonist ultimately making a final choice with the ing, making a final choice to solve the primary conflict. So a series of events of reaction and consequences, meaning how the protagonist reacts to the problem, and the consequences of that reaction would be the rising action per se. All right. So it builds on. It could be a series of mistakes or not facing the not addressing the conflict. So there are some minor effects or consequences of not resolving the conflict or the problem, which leads to finally the climax, where the protagonist finally makes a choice and addresses the primary conflict. The climax is a cold climax because it's where the protagonist finally decides that whether he likes it or whether she likes it, he or she has to face and solve and address the conflict. It's either he was able or she was able to solve or not, nonetheless, address. This is where he addresses it. That's why you're always sitting at the edge of your chairs. And next we have the following action, where the following action presents the results and effects of the protagonist's ultimate choice in addressing the primary conflict, meaning the effects, the emotional effect of how, whether it's positive or negative approach to addressing the conflict, you are now left with the feeling that, oh, so that's what happened next. So that's the result of of his choice. And then finally, it leads to well, the following action presents effects to the character, the self, meaning the character, effects to others, meaning the other characters, and sometimes effect to the society, or sometimes all of these elements are present in the story. And then finally, it leads to a resolution. More often than not, the resolution and the following action is short, and the longest part would be the rising action. So once the climax is reached, it's the going down is really quick, really quick. Now the resolution is more of the wrapping up and giving conclusion, like what other elements or what other questions that the viewers and readers were not able to look for answers. Some of it are answers in the wrap up and the conclusion part of the resolution, and final and finality and closure. All right. Um, we also call resolution as the denouement. Denouement, all right? So this is where we want our students to process narrative text. So if we are teaching our students the process of comprehending narrative text, it is very important for us to cut specific points of the story and help them extract the elements of the story. All right, thereby helping them understand not just their own perspective of understanding the selection, but also understanding the elements in the story, and also getting from the elements of the story we get the message of the author. Now let's practice this using the eat my fine coat. I'm sorry, we should go back to that. Let me get out of that. I need to copy and paste. All right, let's identify the exposition. All right, let's have the first, this is our mini workshop. So let's have this, sorry. Let's identify what part of the plot the first two paragraphs are. One day, a rich man was invited to a banquet at the home of the most important man in the town. All day as he worked in his vineyard, the rich man thought with relish of the fine food and the good conversation ahead of him. So I think here it's quite apparent now where the setting is, right? It says here was invited to a banquet. Banquet could be, is it done in the morning or evening? Well, it says all day, so that means after the day he has to go to the banquet, so it has to be evening. All right, so what's the time? Probably in the evening. All right, so what's the place? It says here the home of the home of the most important man in the town. So we could say the host's house. So in terms of setting, Claro Dito's exposition, we are able to find the setting. We have the time, evening, because of the word banquet. Some of the stories would not say what directly. We need to help our students to understand, to comprehend. So at this point here, after reading the first paragraph, we stop and then help our students process and identify the setting. All right. So who's the character now? The major character. We cannot, because remember that the protagonist, we can identify the protagonist if it satisfied two considerations. The one who faces and solves the problem. So let's identify the conflict first. But alas, he had misjudged his day's work and he arrived home with too little time to dress with the particular care needed for such a grand occasion. It was either not wash and dress or be late for dinner, and he must on no account be late for dinner. So off he went into his work day dress and with the marks of his day's toil upon his hands and face. So we can now identify here the conflict. So we could say the question would be, why would there be a consequence that the host did not entertain the rich man? Why were the other guests? Why did the other guests not talk to him during dinner? Okay, the answer is in the second paragraph. Look, he went in his workday dress and with the marks of day's toil upon his hands and face. And it's a dinner, it's a banquet. That means all the rest of the people out there are dressed for the occasion. But this guy, this rich man, did not wear. So whose conflict is that? We look at the conflict. So he was asking himself, should I change my clothes? Should I wear appropriate clothes? But remember that internal conflict means he is now asking himself. So On that point, had he decided to take a bath and wore the right clothes, would there be a story? Would there be events leading to other guests not talking to him or to the host not talking to him and so on and so forth? No, there wouldn't be other reactions and consequences if he had decided to wear the appropriate clothes and take a bath. So at this point, who created the problem? It's the rich man. So we can now identify who are the major characters. So if we do not guide our students in this way, students immediately will think that the host and the guests were the antagonists because in terms of their attitude, it was negative towards the host. All right. We're not yet looking at the lessons of the story. We're still understanding, okay? Understanding the selection based on its elements, okay? So here, we can now identify that the setting is setting time, dinner time, that will be evening. Next, we have or early evening. Then we have the time, that will be the time where the location is on the host house, all right? Character, who is the protagonist, who faces and solves the problem. Basically, the rich man, right? He was the one who faces all the scorn, the astonishment of the guests and the host. So he is able to satisfy that, the rich man. But who's the antagonist? Who creates the problem? Apparently, consequently, the rich man was the one who decided not to wear proper clothes and not to take a bath on an occasion that you're supposed to do those. So he created his own problem. Therefore, we can now say that the rich man is occupying two major characters, the antagonist and the protagonist at the same time. So it is a type of conflict where it's character versus self. Okay? It is not character versus character. I think a lot of stories in the Philippines and a lot of how we teach our students is that it's always well, that's how I observe some of the teachers. I'm not going to mention where. That when we teach our students identifying the major characters, the protagonist always with the positive values or the positive attitude, while those who are with negative values or yung masama ugali would always be the antagonist. Oh gosh, or pangit and so on and so forth. Or kung guwapo maganda, we don't do that. Paano yung empeng negro? Right? How do we describe that? Another one would be si Mang Tasyo. How would you look at the stories that they don't necessarily have those type of character type of goody good perspective, goody good character, and yet they do not satisfy the considerations of the major characters. All right. So this is the exposition now. We were able to identify. So what's the conflict again? The conflict is he decided not to wear clothes, proper clothes. He decided not to take a bath. He decided not to take a bath and wear proper clothes to dinner. So that was a problem. Okay. So setting, we have dinner time. Place, we have the host house, and we have the character. We have the major character, the antagonist and the protagonist is the rich man himself, and we have the conflict, which is he decided not to take a bath and wear appropriate clothes to the banquet or dinner. Here, once done, all right, you say, very good students. Now let's proceed. So you can probably ask them, say, if this is, say, a module, yan ang sinasabi ko last time. What if it's in the module? This is in the module. That's why I've been saying that in the module, there must be an audio file that for each paragraph and say, uh, uh, read paragraph 1 and 2. So instruction 1, read paragraph 1 and 2. All right, then read paragraph 1 and 2, and then processing. There's a box that says processing. Listen to the audio as the teacher explains. All right, or ask questions and then you answer. And then once done, very good. Let's now proceed to paragraph 3 and 4. So there's a processing. It's helping our students go through the process of comprehending not on just the product of comprehension as a product. So let's proceed. When he arrived at the host's door, the rest of the guests had already come, and conversations buzzed around the room. Curiously enough, no one asked the rich man's opinion on any matter, though at other banquets he had been the one most solicited for comment and advice. The host himself scarcely noticed him, and when the time came for the guests to be seated for dinner, the rich man was placed in the spot farthest removed from the host. So, what were the reactions of the people based on the problem posed by the rich man? No one paid attention to him, even the host. So, what was the consequence? Huh? No one spoke to him. So, what the consequence? What was the consequence? Fourth paragraph. Quietly, the neglected guest excused himself from the group and hurried home. There he scrubbed himself from bald head to heels. Next, he attired himself handsomely in his new baggy trousers, an elegant shirt vest, and his largest turban. Then he slipped into his new fur coat, but by far the most striking garment in all the town. At last, he was ready. So this is the consequence now. He went home, and so that people will start talking to him. So he had now to take a bath and wear proper clothes. Now let's look at now what will happen. Other consequences. So now it's now a chain of events that is more of a cause effect relationship that because of the conflict, it there is an effect, and the effect becomes a cause because he did not wear the proper clothes. No one talked to him because no one talked to him as a consequence as an effect becomes now a cause for the rich man to go home and take a bath and wear appropriate clothes. Now that cost of the rich man to go home and wear appropriate clothes becomes now a cause for an effect here. Ito na yung effect na the people there, the guests and the host, started talking to him and treating him like a guest of honor. Okay, so let's now have the climax. Almost going to the climax part. With his head held high, the rich man presented himself again at the host's door. Every eye was upon him as the servants admitted him to the house. Rising immediately, the host came to greet him and led him straight to the place of honor at his own tray. As the dinner progressed, the host addressed one question after another to his learned guest and served him the fine foods as soon as they were brought in by the servants. But host's astonishment, the rich man began stuffing first one food and then another into the generous pockets of his new coat. So this one becomes now again an effect of the cause. So it becomes the cause, there's an effect, and then there's a cause, then the cause becomes an effect. So it becomes a chain of cause effect type of events. And then finally, eat fine clothes, he would say each time he tucked another handful into the pockets. So how do you think, which part is the climax part here? It is how the people, how he addressed. What was the problem again? The problem was he did not wear the proper clothes. So what's his resolution now? The climax now is that how will now people, does he address it by going home and wearing proper clothes? And here's now the following action. So people started paying attention to him and treating really, really well, really, really, really well. And now we come now to the resolution. Eat my fine coat. He would say each time he tapped another handful, that's a falling action, another handful of food into the pockets. Eat my fine coat. First, the host watched and everyone watched, but no one could make any sense of the rich man's strange behavior. Finally, the host could remain silent no longer about the matter. My good sir, said he, what are you doing? Ah, sir, I am but feeding the guests you invited to the banquet. When I came the first time this evening, you gave me no notice at all. When I came the second time, you treated me as a guest of honor. I have not changed. I am still the same man. Therefore, it must be my third coat to which you are giving such honor. Since my coat is the guest of honor, it should have a fair share of this fine food. So the resolution now is that the rich man give the rich man and the guest a piece of his mind that he was not treated well because of the way he looked. All right. Now let's now proceed to that will be the resolution now. You now proceed to the questions like, did you agree with? So you now look at the author. What do you think is the message of the author right now? What's the theme? Oh, hospitality. It's about treating people well despite how they look. Um, also, hospitality, meaning whether you like the person or not, you still have to be kind to them despite how they look, because there are people, they're still human beings, and so on. The rest goes up to what we call as understanding the author, and then once we get to understand the author's message, we ask our students, "Do you agree with the author?" You are now making the students converse with the author via how the author presented his message in the selection. What happens is that what we do is that when our students are left on their own to read the selection, is that they will have their own understanding of the selection, and that's right. They can impose their own understanding of the selection, but it's not the end of it. There should be a process where they should be gradually introduced to the different elements of the story and different parts of the plot, and thereby refining their comprehension, moving towards the author's perspective, extracting the author's message via the theme, via the lesson or moral, if it's more of a parable or more of a fable, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of it, we ask our students to extend their understanding by asking whether they agree with the treatment of the guest and the host, to the early treatment of the host and the guest, to the rich man who came to dinner without taking a bath and wearing proper clothes. Now, if you were the guest, you can ask them in different perspectives, and the character perspectives. Like, if you were the host, how would you have handled the situation? If if you were the rich man, what would you feel? So you're now putting your students in different perspectives, and becomes an extension of their comprehension. It never ends. It never ends. A lot of things. That's why it comprehension process. It's not it's never ending. It's like when you watch a good movie and you go home, your mind is continuously processing it, and sometimes you have difficulty going to sleep because your mind keeps on recalling, recursively going through the different elements, refining your understanding, and so on. That's how comprehension should be treated, and that's how we're supposed to teach our students. Okay. So, how is comprehension of narrative text extended to other skills? We're now on the fifth question. Let me see if I'm on time. Okay, I'm on time. How is comprehension of narrative text extended to other skills? So making receptive. So reading alone, it is difficult for us teachers to know if our students are comprehending by just silently looking at their facial expressions, or especially with this pandemic where their students are learning at home. How can we be sure that they are comprehending the selection, and how can we make sure that the module or the online material somehow help them refine and guide them in the comprehension process? So what we can do is, so remember that the comprehension process is amorphous. We cannot see it's in the minds of our students. We are not supernatural that we can read what's going on inside the minds of our students during the comprehension or the reading process. Since we are not physically present during the time where the students are understanding it, or online, if it's a live feed of teaching students how to read narratives, we cannot surely independently understand whether students are individually understanding the selection based on how you want them to, based on how you guide them to understand the selection. So it is best that we help our students talk about the selection. So you can come up with the questions that I created. Okay, ask the questions like that, starting with what do you think about the story? Did you like it or not? And then moving towards the text-based questions, and then author-based questions. All right, leading to that. Or you can also ask students to extend their comprehension through writing. either via answering the story grammar of who, what, when, where, and how, and so on and so forth, giving them a graphic organizer to accomplish, or you can ask them to, in speaking, to record their own retelling of the story, or uh, record their answers to the comprehension guide questions at every step. Okay, every strategic points in your story that can be done, or representing it via making, a letter, a shout out, or a motto, or a brochure, or some kind of representing that is using technology that utilize their comprehension. It could be a podcast talking about hospitality. If you were the rich man, like a talk show, it can be represented via uh, uh, a vlog, perhaps. So these are the things that we can help our students comprehend the selection. And I hope the process that I gave you is more of refining your own way of comprehending the selection as a teacher and as a reader. Because if the way we understand and the way we read the selection and how we were taught that it's always questions before and questions after, then there's a huge possibility that we are not actually helping our students understand the selection. And more often than not, what happens is that our students are so stressed because every question that you ask at the end of the selection, of reading the selection, they go back recursively to the story. We're reading the whole selection, and it's so frustrating when they can always ask themselves, saying, why could you just ask us to stop at this point and you ask those questions where at least we can, it's easy for us to recall and understand it. Not at the end of a selection, especially if it's a short story or a novel that you make me finish, and yet what I did is just I enjoyed reading it. So there's a huge difference between recreatory reading and from informative reading. So by this, we are able to help our students not just give meaning to the text, but get meaning from the text and be able to communicate with the author of the narrative via constant negotiations of the events and the story elements presented in the story. With that, I will end my session on teaching comprehension of a narrative text. So I think I am now ready to entertain questions from our viewers.
Hello, Doc. Good afternoon po.
Hi, good afternoon.
Okay, Doc. So here are the questions from our viewers po this afternoon. So first question po natin, Doc, is from Mr. DJ. Ayan po. What are
Mr.
the
DJ.
Yes po. What are the classification of students according to reading levels, and what assessment can they give, especially for non-readers? Thank you po.
That's it. That's too many questions in one question. So you have here, there's what we call as the reading levels. We have the literal level, and we have the interpretive level, and we have the applied level. So let me answer first that in the reading, that's not what we call that as the levels of comprehension, or the reading levels, the level we understand it. So if students are just understanding the text perspective, the text itself, it is called literal. The way it was stated, the way it was there, like the characters are, they just, list down the characters. But if you ask questions like, of the many characters presented in the story, who are the major characters, or who is the antagonist, or who is the protagonist? So that is now interpretive, because students are now using their schema of understanding what a major character is. But remember, they will not have a schema if you did not teach them how to identify antagonists and protagonists. What the teachers are doing out there is that they just teach literal, what's in the text, or automatically go to applied. The interpretive is not taken, the interpretive level is taken for granted where negotiations happen, all right? So it's a pendulum. You have the author here, and you have the text here. And the reader is trying to understand the selections as the narrative in itself. So that's literal. And then agreeing with the author, that's applied now, and then whether they agree or not, and whether it's applicable to their lives or not. So that's a pendulum from the left to the right. So we did not take care of the interpretive level, where constant negotiations. Am I right with my understanding of the author? What does the selection say? So interpretive is what we call as the interactive process, where teachers help students look for, rummage through the selection as to the elements and understand and refine their understanding of the text. That's literal. All right? Halimbawa, ang tanong ng bata ay, Sir, sabi na, when did the story take place? When did the story take place? That's a question of the time, the setting, specifically the time. That child would say, banquet or during dinner time. That's literal. But if that's more literal because he just extracted what was exactly mentioned in the story. But if the child says, okay, if the child says, I think that it's during evening time, the child now uses his understanding, his comprehension to the clue in the text that, oh, when it says dinner and it's banquet, it's usually during evening, not in the morning. So there's no, the child gets the literal information from the selection and gives meaning to the literal information by saying, oh, it's in the evening, using his schema. But then again, remember, if the child's word knowledge is low, there's the interpretive processing of the selection is compromised. So you may want also to look at, in say, non-reader. There's a possibility that students have vocabulary problems. If they have vocabulary problems, there's a possibility they have problems also with, basic beginning reading skills like uh, attacking sounds and words, or word attack skills, like getting the meaning of words in using context clues, or using the structure of the word. There a lot of strategies of that would be basically another training for that. That would be on teaching beginning reading, because the premise of teaching comprehension of a narrative text is that they already are readers. All right, readers, they can now decode. All right, so we're helping them move towards critical reading. Now, if students are struggling readers, I think you give them first stories that are not word based, stories that have more pictures than words, probably 70% pictures and less 30% words, so that the comprehension of the students of a narrative is accompanied by a mental image or a picture that facilitates the comprehension. All right, so that's my suggestion to you. So students have problems with word reading skills or word attack skills, and they cannot comprehend a selection that I gave you like that, that's too wordy. So you go back to the basics of the example that I gave you, give them a picture and facilitate the comprehension of a narrative text via a storyboard or through a series of pictures. And then what you can do perhaps later on is that they can now arrange the storyboards and the pictures according to the events and to the chronology of the events, and so on and so forth. And then after that, you introduce basic skills. Let's say words used in the selection are the following. So you focus perhaps on phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and all other beginning skills, on all other beginning skills and sub skills. Thank you very much. And for assessment per se, your questions, I know that some of you already are trained to have questions that are highly literal, highly interpretive. I suggest that for assessment, you do not include the questions on opinions, on likes. Like the reader's perspective questions cannot be, because it's more of a blind questions, all right? Like asking questions like, which of the story did you like most? That is difficult because there's no one right answer for that. So mostly in the test, we have literal questions moving to interpretive questions. Applied questions is, there's not one correct answer. So on assessment, although as much as I would like to detail my answer on that, for those who still have no idea of how the reading process occurs, assessment would be a huge struggle for them. So Mitch and Kia, that could be another topic, assessing reading comprehension. This one is teaching comprehension. So there's a last part of the question, which is on assessment. So that would fall under assessing comprehension of narrative text. That would be another topic per se. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Doc. And that topic is also noted: assessment of comprehension.
Of
Next,
narrative text.
of narrative text. Okay, next question, Doc. This is from Miss Irene Kabatingan. How can we apply this strategy in our new normal modular learning since we cannot correct and process students' misinterpretation of the text?
I like the word when you said was that's it, right? I like the term that you use, miscomprehension, meaning some students miss some of clues, some of the elements, story elements in the narrative text that somehow uh, um, became an obstacle for them to arrive at the most appropriate comprehension. I'm not saying it's inappropriate, but because of missing some of the cues, they miscomprehend the selection. But they can still comprehend the selection in their own way, in the reader's perspective. But if it's in the interpretive level, negotiating meaning via the story elements, then there's always a possibility of identifying that they are wrong in their understanding of the selection based on the elements. Like they were not able to identify correctly the protagonist and antagonist. It alters their understanding of the whole selection per se. All right. So if say going back to the selection that we use, the students identified the host as the antagonist and the protagonist is and the Richmond is the antagonist, is the protagonist. In their head, when they create the mental images, they will create an image that the host and the Richmond are actually fighting. All right, they will not be able to picture that there's an internal conflict in the Richmond character himself. All right. So to answer further your questions here would be um, when you write a module and asking students to understand, to read the narrative text, I'm suggesting that you cut first, okay, exposition, then comprehension. And then next would be rising action and then and climax, and then comprehension exercise. And then you have falling action and resolution and comprehension exercise. Do not have the kind of planning in a regular classroom where you have pre-questions before reading and ask questions after and post questions after reading. There must be interactivity, a processing in between. Why? Because you are not there. And I'm suggesting highly that it comes with an audio, all right, that audio, because it would help greatly help your students that while they are going through the understanding of a narrative text at every major events in the story, the exposition, the rising action, there's an explanation coming from the teacher via audio. Now, if it's online material, it's an online feed. You can have this, like what I did is you can have a selection and then a picture that shows the events of the picture of the event and then process it. So this is the part called exposition. So let's now answer the following question. Where does the story take place? Where is the story located or happens? Where does the story happen? And so on and so forth. So do not have all those questions at the end of the story. Have it at every part of the parts of the plot. So my suggestion is I divide it into three major parts. You have the exposition, then the rising and the climax, the falling and the resolution or denouement. So there will be comprehensions before, during, and then after. There you go. Thank you very much.
Okay, Doc. And for our last question for this afternoon, this is from Miss Al Cameron Avila. How
Wow.
should we simplify complicated selections full of technical terms like in science? Thank you.
Oh well, that we're talking about now understanding factual or informational text. That I think that will be another topic because that's a different set of skills in attacking that type of text. This is specifically about just narrative text. But if just to answer the questions, because to answer the question so that you can advance it, but that would be another topic, Kia and Michelle. That would be comprehending informational texts. I don't know if you have a session on that. Do you have a session on that, Kia? If there's a session on comprehending informational text or factual text, you may want to attend that. But to answer your question is that you need to help your students understand uh, to extracting the topic of the sentence, the main idea of the sentence, and identifying the supporting details. But the basic skills would be students must be able to distinguish between factual statement and opinionated statement. Once they understand factual statements from opinionated statements, it is easy for them to locate the topic sentence and the regular sentences. And once they do that, once they locate the topic sentence, you teach them now the different types of paragraph, whether the paragraph is beginning or it's a clinching paragraph, or it's an explanatory paragraph, or a body paragraph, or concluding paragraph, how they will extract. You will now teach them how to extract which type of paragraph where you could extract the topic sentence. Once the topic sentence is extracted, students now will be able to locate the supporting details via the transition devices. So if the information, like in science, is mostly listing or explanation, the author may have used first, second, third, fourth. So they will be looking at first, second, first, fourth. Now for vocabulary, now it's especially for science, you now have to teach students three categories of vocabulary. We have the general vocabulary, we have the special vocabulary, and we have the technical vocabulary. Now you need to teach your students that the technical vocabulary are technical definitions of words as used in the subject area of its origin. Like say the word uh, photosynthesis. The photosynthesis is a technical word because its origin is in science. Therefore, its definition is science-based. Even if it's used, say, an English class would use the word photosynthesis, or a math subject will use the photosynthesis, they still go back to its technical definition of science, which is the definition of photosynthesis, where the light, the light of the blah blah, interacts with the chlorophyll of the ganun siya. All right. Now for special vocabulary, you teach students special vocabulary based on I did a research that when I was taking my Master of Arts in teaching reading at PNU on special vocabulary of math and science. There are words that are being shared in across subject areas, and the definition of words in terms of nuances changes. This is what we call as collocations of words. Dami ko nang sinabi na, pero that's another topic, is teaching vocabulary across content areas. Another one that another topic would be teaching reading across content areas. How do you teach reading in science? How do you teach reading in mathematics? So these are the things that you probably are asking from me now. And I know I'm happy that you are thinking beyond my topic, because that means I probably have steered your imagination, I've steered your interest about reading, and now you are moving to other things that you encountered with your students, difficulty in reading, not just in literature or literary pieces, but also in other subject areas. So these are the things that I can answer you right now, but I think that would be a different topic. I just, congested my time just focusing more on the narrative text. So special vocabulary is words that have different meanings in different subject areas. A good example would be the word heart. Heart used in science would be, the heart, the part of the body, the internal organs. But when it's used, say, in literature, figuratively, say, the heart of the ocean. All right, so it's different. Or the head, like the head in the parts of in science would be the parts of the body of a human being or animals. Head, say, in social science would be head of state, has a different meaning now. So that's it. That's how I'm gonna answer that generally, though. But if you want, specific answers to it, strategies, remediation, how to handle all of those, you request a webinar from a YouTube webinar from the Vival Group on teaching vocabulary. All right. Another one is teaching comprehension of informational and factual text. Another one would be teaching comprehension across subject areas. Pero wag naman across subject areas, mahirap yung topics. Ano yan? Mahirapan pong i-congest sa isa't kalating oras. It would be teaching comprehension of science text, teaching comprehension of math text, teaching comprehension of social science text or procedural text. There you go. Thank you very much for that interesting question. Your questions make me think of more topics to give to Vibal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Doc Ricky, for that answer to the question. So, because of our time constraints, these are all the questions we can address for now. So, this is now the time for Doc Ricky for your conclusion and implications.
Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much, Doc.
All right. I almost forgot that I still have, something to say. Have I shared my slides still?
Sige po, Doc. Sige po. Kaso wala pa po siya.
Okay, let
Sige
me
po.
share my slide. Okay. So I will now have my conclusion. Just two slides though, but it's graphical. All right. So let me go back to my conclusion would be always remember that when we teach our students would be in the K-12 program, we utilize the language, literature-based language instruction. It's an approach that we provide a literature for our students and we ask them to comprehend the literature. All right. So once the students are able to comprehend on their own the literature, we now come in to help them acquire the skills. Ito yung sinasabi na interpretive skills, okay? The interpretive reading skills. How do we teach our students the reading skills to make sense of the comprehension? Because it's not enough that you understand the selection, but you need to understand the text and the message of the author via the text. Otherwise, we are just readers, but not critical readers. Remember, my premise on teaching comprehension of a narrative text is towards being critical of what we are reading, especially narratives, because they are powerful. Because narrative texts are powerful because it changes our perspective. It informs indirectly. It somehow drives us emotionally and changes emotionally all throughout the story in itself. So if we are not careful, we may be persuaded to an action that we were not aware that we are actually being persuaded already, or we are being moved or changed into something that we were not aware and we are not ready for. We're not ready for yet. Okay, and then we ask them a certain of grammar, like we know that utilizes features like transition devices that and also transition also words that pertain to tenses like past tense of the verb. That my internet connection is not available. Am I still here? All right. Then after grammar, we ask them again to extend their comprehension of the selection. If it was oral, we can ask them to orally present their comprehension or write something about it, represent it via trimedia or representing, which I explained to you how we can extend it to other skills. But again, there will be different training perhaps or webinar on how to teach how do we help students transcend their comprehension of selections to speaking, writing, and representing. So I would like us to be reminded that implications of teaching comprehending narrative text centers on making our students focus on the conflict. Story is a story because it centers on a conflict, and gradually help our students go through the different events in the story and extract the elements of the story. So via the events, the plot, the story elements are embedded in the plot. So exposition, we have three story elements here: the setting, we have the major characters, and we have the conflict. Rising action toward the climax, and the falling action is where we find two more elements: the reaction and the consequence. All right, reaction and the consequence. And then at the end, the denouement, we now have the final element, the story element, which is resolution, or how the story ends, or how the protagonist resolves the conflict. With that being said, I hope that we change the way we teach comprehension, not just as a product or teaching our students to just feel the selection, but coming up with, say, a stage by stage or a process of making our students go through the different plots of the story and helping them look for the story elements, and thereby helping them comprehend the selection in literal level, interpretive level, and of course, applied level. With that being said, thank you very much again. And if you have more questions on like how to assess comprehension, how to teach grammar, how to teach grammar of comprehension, grammar and comprehension, how to teach vocabulary, and other things that you can think of because of the topic that I gave you, please inform out my moderator and the education service of Ibal so that we can plan out those topics for you. Thank you very much for tuning in again. And it has always been a pleasure for me to provide, it's just, some knowledge that I know about comprehension. And I'm always honored to be of help to you guys out there. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon to all of you.
There we have it. Thank you so much, Brother Ricky, for this very informative weekender that we had for our elementary education webinar series. Thank you so much, Doc. And of course, to all our Kavibal viewers, it is our honor to have you for this one whole week for our webinar series. We're hoping to see you again later for our FB Live session and of course next week for the other series of webinars that we will be having. Muli po, magandang araw sa ating lahat, magandang hapon and happy weekend everyone.